So hi everyone, I'm here with Lyra Mota to talk a little bit about MIFID2 and the very interesting report that Mira and her colleague came up with and some of the interesting conclusions. But if I'm going to ask Mira just really briefly to give us her background, and you see her beautiful window in the back showing hills of Italy where she's located right now. But Mira, give us a little background and then we'll just go into some discussions on your report.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. So I'm Lyra Mota. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia Business School. I'm in my last year right now. Previous to go to Columbia, I went to a master's school in Brazil where I studied economics at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio. And then previous to that, I studied international affairs in Brasilia.
So let's go right into the impetus on what you and your colleague why you decided to take on, Lyra, the MIFID2 rules, the whole idea of unbundling and bundling, and obviously, you neither one of you had a background in capital markets or finance or trading or research, so it's interesting to give us an idea of what made you take on this project.
Sure. So Ifon and I, we were in the middle of our PhD, and one of the questions that always interested us was information production in capital markets. We know that paying for information is difficult because of the nature of information. So it's difficult to pay for information because we call it there is no rival, right? So information, once it's out there, everyone can use without paying for it. So it's very difficult to pay for the optimal level of information. So at the time also, we were studying this at school, thinking about these issues, and then we started to look at the MIFID2 resolutions. It was before MIFID2 took place in 2018, but it was everywhere in the news. At that point, we decided, okay, that's an amazing opportunity to do a very rigorous empirical research on how the change in the payment schedule for information actually affects the results and how information is produced.
Before we go into the conclusions and then the methodology, when you looked at this whole aspect, explain the essence when you did your research on it. Explain the essence of why do you think why you think MIFID2 was implemented and what were the reasons behind it before we go into some of those other factors.
Sure. So based on our research, the idea of MIFID2 was to improve market transparency. So in general, we always had the soft dollars practice that caused some conflicts of interest between mutual funds and final investors. So the idea here is that you as a fund manager, you can have a contract with your brokerage and you're going to receive these soft dollars or pay the soft dollars in return of services that your final investors might not be aware of it. And it was exactly in order to control or to reduce this conflict of interest that the European Union came with the MIFID2, saying like we are going to increase transparency, and as a consequence, we also expect to increase competitivity in this market.
So let's just talk a little bit about your conclusions, and then we'll just go to methodology. So, what were your conclusions and your findings specifically, and were they in conflict to the essence of MIFID2?
Okay, perfect. So what we found in our research were basically two results that we find very important. The first one is that MIFID2 caused a decrease in the amount of analysts covering firms. So there was a decrease in quantity of information as we interpreted. On the other hand, we found that there was increase in quality. And the idea here is that we think that MIFID2, by requiring that information was paid directly instead of being through the soft dollars type of contracts, it incentivized better production of information. So the consumer became more selective in the type of research that they were buying. That per se causes analysts also to be more careful, I would say, in producing better quality of information. And on top of this, and then we go to the heterogeneous effects. How does MIFID 2 affect differently different firms? And what we found that was completely, I would say, almost against what we were reading on the news all the time, was the fact that it was not the smallest firms that were most affected by the decrease in quality. Instead, were the largest firms who were more affected by MIFID 2. And the largest firms, they decrease the number of analysts by much more than the small firms. And whereas the research quality affected both large and small firms equally.
Interesting. And as you probably know, the EU is about to unveil a series of adjustments to the MIFID 2 rules based on complaints by lobbying firms and some brokers. One of the things that is going to be a big effect is they're saying that companies with market caps of less than €1 billion will be exempt from the rules of unbundling, and their reasoning is to encourage greater analyst coverage and thus trading in the stock. And they also mentioned kickstarting the economy, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but this goes against your fundamental and quantitative research, right? So talk a little about that. Like, why do you think the EU would do something like that? And because it does go against what you guys concluded.
Yes, it definitely goes against the results that we found empirically in the paper. I think that the main argument that people, and including the EU regulators, had in mind was the fact that information is expensive to produce. So if information is very expensive to produce, you need a large pool of investors in order to kind of subsidize the production of this information. And then exactly for those small firms, it will be the hardest to get this minimum amount of investors to pay for information. And if that's the case, the conclusion would be that the amount of information produced for those small firms would decrease or even disappear. What we found was not the case. What is interesting, before I go in the detail in the methodology, is, but already going a little bit in the detail, what we did was we compared the treatment group, which were EU-based firms that are mostly covered by EU analysts, with US firms that are mostly covered by US analysts. Therefore, the EU firms are more affected by MIFID 2 rather than the US firms. What we found that in both continents, in Europe and in the United States, there was a decrease already before MIFID 2 of coverage of small firms. So the fact that it's decreasing was not due to MIFID, was instead something that it was a secular trend in this industry. So definitely the argument that small firms are more affected by MIFID 2 due to the smaller coverage that they are having right now is not something that we found empirically. Although that theoretically could be the case. But what we think that is behind this argument is that although we have this idea that like we need to cover the fixed costs for research, there is another side of research, which is the conflict of interest that we talked in the beginning, right? So the idea here is that MIFID 2, by requiring that the fund managers pay directly for research, we think that the analysts and the analyst industry becomes more competitive. And in that case, what is going to happen is that they are going to be producing the research that is most valuable for end investors. And in that case, for larger firms, for example, there is much more duplicated services than there is for smaller firms. And we find strong evidence that is those duplicated services that are being removed from the market after MIFID 2.
Great, and let's get to the most exciting part of this talk, which is the methodology. So talk a little bit about the methodology, how you approached it, what kind of methodology you used, how you analyzed, and how you got to these results.
Sure. So the idea here is that we have a shock, MIFID 2, right, that will affect the market. So we could compare the affected region, which is Europe, with a control group. We know that the US is not a perfect control because we live in a global market, and the US is also affected by MIFID2, though it's less affected, at least in a short period of time. Because of this observation, what we do in this research is to compare some outputs that will include measures for quality and for quantity before and after MIFID, comparing the treatment group, which is Europe, the affected countries, and US. And then by comparing those two countries with controls, of course, for firm size or profitability and etc., we are going to see how does the MIFID2 affect research quantity and research quality. Should I go in the details what we actually measure? Okay, so for research quantity, the first thing that we analyze is the number of analysts covering a firm. And we find that on average, there is a decrease in the amount of analysts covering a firm in Europe when compared to the US. As we already discussed, this decrease comes only from the large firms. And there is no significant difference between the US and Europe for small firms. For research quality, it's a little bit more tricky because how do you measure quality, right? What we do is something that we can measure quantitatively, which is to measure the analyst forecast error. And the idea is if the earnings forecast error is smaller, there is better quality of research. And in that case, we find a significant decrease in error for Europe than for the US, for both group, large and small firms. And this difference is equal. Now, the next step for our research is like, why is that happening? Is basically we want to think about what is the mechanism behind this decrease in quantity and increase in quality. And in that sense, we want to test the idea that there was an increase in competition in the analyst research industry. To do that, what we do is to analyze who are the analysts who are leaving the industry, who are the ones that are being out. And then we find two things. That we find that the analysts who drop out are the analysts that on average are the worst analysts. Okay, so they are the analysts who, if you do a ranking that is comparable across analysts, the ones that are in the lowest rank, the probability of dropping out after MIFID2 is much larger than the one that are top in the rank. And then the next test that we make is to compare within an analyst. So you look at one analyst before and after MIFID. And you see that these analysts, even if it continues to cover the same firm that they were covering before MIFID2, this analyst becomes a better analyst in the sense that he produces or she produces better research in terms of earnings forecast error.
Excellent. And from the data, specifically, what factors led to the reduction in research coverage for large caps? I know that's, and then can you talk about how I think you mentioned it, but how you measure the quality aspect in more detail?
Mm-hmm. What we think that is happening is that, I think all of you know, right, that now the fund managers have to pay directly for analyst research. That makes them to be more selective in the type of research that they are actually going to purchase. This causes a decrease in the numbers of analysts hired, and therefore in the equilibrium number of analysts, right? And the idea here is that these large firms, there were many more analysts covering a firm to begin with rather than the small firms, which make us to conclude that one fund manager is probably hiring multiple research services for the same firm. Now that you have to pay, these fund managers have to pay directly for each one of them, they will choose the best and keep only the best. Therefore, those duplicated ones are going to be out, right, of the market. And we think that this is the main reason or the main mechanism why we see the drop in the largest firm. So our main measure of quality, as I mentioned before, is forecast error. So we think about analysts making forecasts about the earnings, right, of a firm. And then when the earnings actually happens, we think like how off this analyst was. And we calculate this error by firm and by analyst. And this is our dependent variable. This is our main measure. We also measure in another ways as a robustness. The first one is we call it how can I explain the easiest way? I'm sorry here but we call it analyst dispersion. The dispersion here is what is the standard deviation of all earnings, all the predictions. And the idea is that if everybody clustered together, if there is a true number, smaller is the dispersion, better is the quality, because everybody's converging to the same number. In the literature, in the academic literature, people have found some evidence that this is also a measure for quality. And then we also find that for Europe compared to the US, the dispersion decreased. The third one, also as a robustness, is how prices respond to analyst revisions. The idea is that if a revision of analyst has more information, so is actually creating more information for the market, the prices should move more as a response of an analyst revision than before. And if you agree with that, this is also a measure of quality, because it's basically how important it is to read this analyst research. And then we find, again, the same thing. So these responses for analyst revisions are bigger in Europe with respect to the US after MIFID2.
Great. And I know there's been a few other studies which you referenced in your study on MIFID2 the last couple of years, but you come to a little bit different conclusion. So for those who maybe have read those studies, can you talk about how your conclusions are a little different than others that have looked at?
Sure. I think the main difference, and actually we came up to understand what is the difference, and we don't find it as a difference, it's just like a different methodology, is from the Lang et al. Paper. What they find is that the larger firms are more affected. The difference between our study and theirs is how you define larger firm. And that's very important, because for them, I'll be a little bit technical, and then I will explain the intuition, okay? But what they do is that they get the coverage of a firm, okay? And then they use this as dependent variable on a regression where the independent variable is size, like market cap. So they are going to call large firm a firm that has a big epsilon. So what is a large firm? A large firm is a firm that is big with respect to the amount of analysts that they have covering. So if you're a large firm, but also you have a large number of analysts covering you, in their research, you're actually a small firm, okay? Because you're large in terms of market cap, but you're small in terms of the number of analysts that is covered. And then here, and of course, there is a very large correlation between the size of the company measured as market cap and the number of analysts that covers this firm. Okay, we measure size directly as market cap. So if you're a large firm, if you are Apple, or if you are any other large firm, you are large because you have large market cap, independently on how the number of analysts that you cover. That explains the main difference between our paper and their paper, because as we show this in one of our internet appendixes, that what they're calling large, we are calling small, and what they're calling small, we are calling large.
In the Financial Times recently, they also did a analysis of a report that was done by LiquidNet, which is a third-party liquidity provider who's now involved in independent research, and they said of all the fund managers they talked to, and this is on a global basis, that 70% of them were implementing some form of unbundling. 70%. So it's definitely migrated away from Europe into other parts of the world, whether it's the U.S., South America, Asia. So it's everywhere now. And I think the big the big item that people will be looking at is this idea that you come up with, which is quantity versus quality. I think most fund managers, being an ex-fund manager myself, I definitely prefer quality over quantity. And this is something that your research, which was very quantitative in nature, it comes out and says, hey, quality is rising to the top. Correct? I mean, that's sort of the fundamental conclusion you're coming to.
And definitely it is. And then, I mean, I think it's still an open question. What is the welfare conclusions of MIFID 2? Unfortunately, this is a very difficult question because it's very difficult to be able to measure, like, how does it affect firms' investment in the end of the day, right? What we are actually interested in. But there is a trade-off. And the question here is a decrease in quantity and an increase in quality. We tried to measure this in the data, looking at, for example, liquidity, to see if MIFID 2 affected the liquidity of firms that are losing coverage. In our research, we did not find any results, but we are careful in interpreting these results because we know that many other things happen together, and those price variables is very difficult to identify from just one shock.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully some of the EU ministers and others that are some of the lobbying groups will read your report and see some of these conclusions, because I think it was very well done, very well thought out, and the conclusions are clear. So listen, Lyra, I'd like to thank you very much. If anyone would like the complete report, you can send me an email like you'll see below. Also, you can send me a message on LinkedIn. I'll be more than happy to forward it to you. I think Lyra would be happy that the more people that read it, the better. It's been quoted in a few different publications. Definitely. That's how I really saw it in the beginning. But Lyra, again, I want to thank you very much and tell your colleague, unfortunately, couldn't make it, but thank him again. And hopefully we'll see more great work from you when you're back finishing your PhD in New York.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas, for the opportunity.